due to the webinar format, you won't see their videos, however. Yeah, it's just, that they can see you.
So I think then we can start, no? Well, good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to open this series of talks, events, round tables organized by the Psychoanalytic Studies program at the Institute of Comparative Literature and Society here at Columbia. We're starting a new series, and I think it's appropriate. I don't like the metaphors of the opening and reanimation and all the metaphors that can be used for this moment, but there is certainly, in our small world at least, in the Psychoanalytic Studies program, a change that is important and that is manifested, among other things, by this lecture series, but also by the fact that the person presenting tonight, which I have the pleasure and the honor to present, Adele Tutter, is the new co-director of this program. She's an MD and holds a PhD, is clinical associate professor of psychiatry, and also on the faculty of the Center for Psychoanalytic Research and Training here at Columbia. She also teaches, is involved in the faculty of the New York Psychoanalytic Institute. Her publications are numerous, and they're all concerned with the intersection of psychoanalysis, creativity, and laws. It should be mentioned, and it becomes very obvious from the way she works, that she also is a psychoanalyst in private practice, and that she's very familiar with publications, being board member at the International Journal of Psychoanalysis and the Psychoanalytic Quarterly. American Imago might be of particularly relevance because of the Imago, which leads us to the topic of the talk tonight. And I think the talk, so I didn't mention all the publications and the names and titles, which are wonderful, but I had the pleasure to read the paper in advance, and I can say that there's nothing as good as an introduction to her work than the paper itself. So without further ado, I would like to give her the opportunity to present on Poussin's Narcissus. Please, Adele. So just to say a couple words about the procedure, she will speak, and then I'll make 2-3 remarks as a little response, and then we open this to a general discussion.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Marcus. And thank you, Sarah, for helping us to organize this series, which we hope will help to bring psychoanalysis into closer proximity to the academy. Since I was a graduate student in actually molecular genetics, I always found that the most interesting things that were being done were done at the intersection of different disciplines and different thought. And so my work as a PhD student so long ago had to do with the evolution of genetic systems that code for immune proteins, antibodies, which are very much in the news these days. But it's very exciting work to work at the intersection of different disciplines. It's often where a lot of the excitement is. So I wanted to welcome you all to this new series of programs. The Psychoanalytic Studies program that I've been invited to co-direct is hosted by the Institute of Contemporary Literature and Society, and it's open to all students in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. And anyone who's interested in learning about the curriculum and taking some of our courses or signing up for the certificate program, I encourage you to contact me or my co-director, Stathis Grigoris, to learn more about it. And I'd be happy to do that. So now I'm going to share my keynote. I always fall asleep in purely audio presentations, and so given the subject matter, I thought you would all enjoy seeing some slides, and will help us go along also to deal with the text, because there'll be a lot of text excerpts. So today I'll be presenting some of my work on the Ovidian paintings of Nicolas Poussin. First, I want to explain how a practicing psychoanalyst came to be interested in an old master. My good friend Dorothy Dunn was hired by the National Trust to open the Philip Johnson Glass House in New Canaan, Connecticut to the public after Johnson's death in 2005. And she gifted me a ticket for the tour. They were hot items when the Glass House was opened. Everybody around the world, most architectural historians were dying for a chance to see this legendary complex of buildings. Johnson had built 2 climate-controlled buildings that were essentially museums at the Glass House, the sculpture gallery and the painting gallery, to house his collection of modern art. But since the Glass House was completed in 1949, he exhibited only one painting in it, and that was called The Burial, or is called The Burial of Phocion by Nicolas Poussin. And when I saw it, I said to myself, what is an old master doing in one of the most iconic modernist houses of the century? And what was it doing blistering in the sun, direct sunlight? This question inspired an essay, and that essay eventually became a book. And while I was researching Poussin, who painted the painting, I was intrigued by the fact that one of his first paintings, and also his very last painting, was on the theme of Apollo and Daphne. Here is a close-up of the burial of Phocion, which actually was very meaningful in the context of the house. One whole chapter of my book is dedicated to this painting. But Apollo and Daphne, as conceived by Poussin, was my introduction to Ovid's Metamorphoses, which is a metaphorical fantasy of the protean changes of life and an authoritative source book for countless artistic visualizations. As a psychoanalyst, I obviously found the myth of Narcissus and the fact that Poussin painted serial paintings on the theme very, very interesting. And so I arrived at Ovid in true psychoanalytic fashion by following a series of associations via Johnson and then Poussin. In 1898, Havelock Ellis coined the term narcissism to describe patients with excessive self-love. And then Freud used the term for the first time in his 1910 essay on Leonardo, and then again in his 1914 essay on narcissism. Yet Freud never really explicated the myth of Narcissus as a means to understanding what we have now come to regard as narcissism: grandiosity, lack of empathy, etc. And yet, in a rather circular fashion, psychoanalysts have tended to treat Freud's essay on narcissism as though it was a primary classical source. Indeed, the psychoanalyst Roger Dufresne writes, "When I returned to the ancient authors in the hope of discovering why and how Narcissus had become narcissistic, I was surprised to find there was very little." So rather than approaching the myth of Narcissus from Freud's or a standard psychoanalytic perspective, I will proceed under the suppositions that the poets and the artists that interpret the poets were the first psychologists. They got there first. And as their astute insights into ancient myths stand to enrich and advance psychoanalytic theory, I see the ancient myths, the enduring myths, as parables of the human condition. And I have come to see the metamorphic myths as allegorizing the protean changes of life. For every change, there is a loss. I also hope to hew to Erwin Panofsky's admonition that in the search for intrinsic meanings, that the various humanistic disciplines meet on a common plane instead of as serving as handmaidens to each other. And there is no discipline more guilty of that than psychoanalysis, which has typically treated other academic disciplines as handmaidens and seen its own psychoanalytic metapsychology as superior and capable of imposing meanings in other areas. So today, I'm going to look to the unique and privileged insights that Poussin's aesthetic lens offers to guide our psychoanalytic exploration of the metamorphic myth. Poussin had a classical education and so was well suited to his future reputation as a most perceptive and profound interpreter of Ovidian myth. The myth of Narcissus and Echo was an especially preoccupying theme for Poussin, who painted it at least 4 and maybe up to 6 or more times. Today, I will show that these canvases reflect a deepening interpretation of their textual source, which parallels certain critical junctures in the history of psychoanalytic theories of narcissism. I will also try to show how the development of Poussin's aesthetic vision supports a radical reappraisal of the enigmatic myth that lies at the heart of psychoanalytic theory and practice. As an expatriate artist from France, newly arrived in Rome in the early 1620s, Poussin set about studying and painting the favored themes of local connoisseurs. Amongst his earliest known canvases, if not his first known canvas, is this one, his first known Narcissus, a youthful man surprised by his reflection in a pool of water. His physique is manly enough, but the sweetness of his inclined head and his delicate gesture of wonderment befits Ovid's pubescent figure, who at 16, quote, seemed to be both boy and man. Ovid is credited with melding the myth of Narcissus with the myth of Echo in the Metamorphoses. In his narration, the water nymph Liriope consults the oracle Tiresias, who worries about the survival of her beautiful son. Oh, Liriope worries, and she consulted Tiresias about the survival of her son, Narcissus, who, even as an adult, was adorable. The oracle tells her that her child will live a long life unless he knows himself. Although he trifled with some of the many boys and women who desired him, no young man or woman ever moved him, including Echo, whose advances he rejects after he is separated from his hunting companions. Narcissus discovers his reflection in a pool of water and is overcome by the beauty of the image that he sees. Frustrated by his longing for his elusive image, he dies and is transformed into the flower that bears his name. While Echo, in her unsleeping grief, turns into stone. One of the many suitors Narcissus had previously spurned had chosen to retaliate and appealed to the gods. May he himself love as I have loved him, without obtaining his beloved, and Nemesis answered his prayer. In Poussin's canvas, Cupid puts this prayer into play and makes aim with his arrow and bow. Thus, vanity and self-love are not necessarily to blame for Narcissus's captivation by his reflection. Rather, the crime for which he was cursed was the failure to love another. In Pompeii, one sees frescoes of Narcissus both with and without Echo. Poussin chose to paint Narcissus alone, upright, and holding a spear, following one of these ancient conventions. In contrast, the Metamorphoses specifies that Narcissus spies his image while reclining by the water. And while Ovid never mentions Cupid at all, Cupid was indeed a regular visitor in Pompeii. But despite Echo's presence in Pompeii, by the time of the Renaissance, she had disappeared completely, pretty much, from visual representation. And a solo Narcissus had become the norm, as exemplified by this version by Boltraffio, and by the quite famous portrait by Caravaggio. Poussin eschews his competitor Caravaggio's then radical use of modern dress, but he borrows his acutely angled, tousled head. Thus, Poussin's first Narcissus leans much more on our historical convention than on Ovid's text, consistent with the efforts of an aspiring novice eager to establish himself in a highly competitive arena. The iconic image of an isolated Narcissus lost in his own reflection may have informed Freud's theory about narcissism. In his essay on Leonardo, He mentions the Narcissus myth only briefly and only in the context of homosexual object choice, and he pays no attention to Echo. He writes, the boys whom he now loves are, after all, substitutive figures and revivals of himself in childhood, boys whom he loves in the way in which his mother loved him when he was a child. He finds the objects of his love along the paths of narcissism. For Narcissus, according to the Greek legend, was a youth who preferred his own reflection to everything. So Freud is saying, basically, that this is self-love. And he repeats that self-love by identifying with his mother and then loving another person who he sees as himself. So he's repeating a pattern from his childhood, and that his love object is really just a substitutive figure for himself. Further on, however, Freud imagines that in painting the Mona Lisa, Leonardo met the woman who awakened his memory of his mother's happy smile of sensual rapture. So there's a tension here between Freud's Narcissus, a homosexual who loved boys not as others, but as a revival of himself, and Leonardo's revived memory of a rapturous, dyadic love. It is as if Freud preconsciously knows, but cannot see, that Narcissus's mirror is a metaphor for Mona Lisa's smile. As his reputation grew, Poussin distinguished himself from his peers with his fastidious scholarship and careful study of classical and Renaissance texts. It's thus unsurprising that it was he, in his second painting of the theme, who returned the long-absent Echo to figurative representation in the stunning Louvre Narcissus and Echo. Thereafter, Echo would always accompany Narcissus on his canvas. He also started an art historical trend. It soon became quite commonplace to see Narcissus together with Echo. Although this painting was painted only a few years after the first, the second Narcissus is very different. And it showcases Poussin's newly developed neoclassical signature style with its sharply focused, so-called dry handling of paint. We also see a new fidelity to Ovid's text. Just as it describes, the spent Narcissus lies by the pool, his namesake flowers blooming about him. The presence of Echo is not the only break with then current conventions. In 1628, it was unprecedented to portray Narcissus as dead, or nearly so, in contrast to the typical idealized portrayal of a beautiful boy that minimizes his unhappy fate. Here, he is not the target of Cupid's arrow, but of Nemesis's curse. Poussin retains his jovial Cupid, but we see no quiver or bow. Rather, he raises the torch of love, a cruel rebuke to the diminished figures. While Poussin's previous Cupid is an aesthetic embellishment, this Cupid's torch of love alludes to the text, visualizing a literary metaphorical device. Both Echo's incendiary desire and Narcissus's terrible realization that the spark I kindle is the torch I carry. Ovid's marriage of Narcissus and Echo is felicitous and perhaps inevitable, as the Echo is also a mirror, an auditory mirror, a mirror of sound. Likewise, the mirror is a visual echo. Both Narcissus and Echo are also share in common the fact that they are both victims of frustrated love and of punishing acts of jealous retribution. The goddess Juno deprived Echo of her voice after she deceived Juno and helped her husband Jove to tryst with her fellow nymph. Juno punishing her made it impossible for Echo to say anything except to repeat the last words of somebody else's sentence. Thus, when Narcissus cries, "Hands off, no hugs, I'll die before you have your way with me," Echo replies, "You'll have your way with me." One of Ovid's very funny jokes. Narcissus and Echo are inextricably linked, symbolically and thematically reflecting each other. Doris Panofsky observes that Poussin represents their connection by postural mirroring. Thus, the increased representational fidelity and the visualization of literary metaphor in the second Narcissus implicates Poussin's deepening adherence to Ovid's text. The postural mirroring underlines the importance of the restoration of echo. But let us not leave the second Narcissus so soon. The art historian Oscar Bachman notes that Poussin's previous Narcissus is modeled after one of the dying Niobes in the Uffizi group of Niobe and her massacred children. Niobe iconography became more prevalent after 1583, when the celebrated group of sculptures was unearthed in a construction site in Rome. I believe they were building a road. The association of Narcissus with a son of Niobe is intriguing, as Niobe is quite the conventionally narcissistic figure. Let's review her story. Ovid tells how the prideful queen Niobe refuses to worship the goddess Latona, saying that it is she and not Latona who should be venerated for her riches and her superior fecundity, having 7 daughters and 7 sons, compared to Latona's scant 2. She should have known better, as those scant 2 were Apollo and Diana. They avenged their mother's honor by slaughtering Niobe's prized offspring with their bows and arrows. Rigid in her grief, Niobe turned to stone, condemned to mourn forever. The links are clear. Like Lairope, Niobe idolizes her offspring. Like Narcissus, Niobe is haughty and vain. And like Echo, Niobe is turned to stone, rigid in her grief. Painted just 3 months after the third Narcissus and Echo, the fourth, I meant to say 3 months after the second Narcissus and Echo, the third, Realm of Flora, gathers the diverse figures that in Ovid's verse transform into flowers. At the center dances the goddess Flora, who initiates and oversees their metamorphoses. Although Narcissus and Echo are only one of the stories that this painting tells, there's a lot to say about them. Echo has a more prominent place in this couple compared to the previous painting. She's in the foreground now, not the background, and she's no longer ghost-like, but flesh and blood. She is Flora's counterpart, is equal Narcissus. While in general, an increasingly faithful interpreter of Ovid, Poussin has this Narcissus discovering his reflection not in a natural pool of water, as Ovid specifies, but in a brimming urn, which is a Renaissance motif. He must have thought this departure from the text necessary, especially as he conveniently includes a reflective pool directly adjacent to them, but doesn't use it. Let's look closer at the overflowing vessel. Art historian Matthias Winner suggests that it is an achaia, a resonating vase used to amplify sound in the ancient Greek theater. An apt signifier for echo who shares the same Greek root, eche, or sound. When filled with water, the achaia is also a mirror, a signifier of Narcissus. Echo's achaia is thus a consolidating signifier around which Poussin visualizes their inextricable connection. By providing Narcissus with a mirror, Echo plays an irrefutable part in the construction of his image, an echo of the other. Over 300 years ago, Poussin couched in aesthetic terms the resonating dynamic process that psychoanalysts discovered later, and we'll get to that, the echoing amplification of dyadic mirroring. Like the second Narcissus and Echo, the third also contains a reference to Niobe. In the bas-relief on the sarcophagus at left, art historian Sheila Barker identifies the iconographic raised bent arm that mimics the Niobes as they try to pull the arrows out of their backs. Barker points out that the Niobe theme was popular in Cinquecento sarcophagi. To the immediate right, we see Clytie echoing the signifying posture, adding an extra valence to the reference. In accord, there is more to the Niobe story here. The ancients fancied a rock formation, the Weeping Rock atop Mount Syphilis in modern-day Turkey, to represent Niobe's petrified incarnation. When wet, the porous limestone of the monument still appears to cry, to shed tears. The cliffside at left in Poussin's painting perfectly replicates its famous profile. Moreover, this rocky embodiment illusionistically supplies the fountain below it, which in turn fills the overflowing Achaia. Thus, Poussin conjures Narcissus's reflection in the tears of Niobe, a mother who grieves for her idealized children. Recall that Narcissus's mother is the water nymph Lairope, and Cephisus, the river god who ravished her in the current, is his father. Narcissus's aquatic ancestry marks the lure of his watery visage as a regressive one. Moreover, Narcissus's mother, Lairope, her name is Greek for lily face. And that's a contribution from an analyst, Schengold. Alongside the tears that fill Echo's Achaia, taken together, this suggests that for Poussin, Narcissus's reflective image signifies and summons the mirroring gaze of mother. In 1967, Winnicott theorized that identity is formed through the mirroring of primary caretakers. The precursor of the mirror is the mother's face, which gives back to the baby's own self. While not entirely his own thought, his words gave cogent expression to a developing notion in the psychoanalytic gestalt that, as Harry Stack Sullivan wrote in 1953, the self is formed through the integration of reflected appraisals, that the infant internalizes the appraisals of him that he sees and experiences. Erik Erikson wrote in 1959, in the baby's earliest exchanges of smiles, there is something of a self-realization coupled with a mutual recognition. Responding to these ideas, Lacan in 1960 reconsidered his earlier concept of the mirror stage and suggested that the mirror is a metaphor for the other. And in 1964, Heinz Lichtenstein clarified that the mother reflects back to the child a configuration of its own presence via the reduplication and magnification echo of her libidinous mirroring. And I think that to see the words mirroring and echo in the same sentence here is at least a pre-conscious allusion to the myth of Narcissus, and maybe a pre-conscious insight into the meanings, the metaphorical meanings of that image. Since Narcissus' reflection contains a trace of his watery origins, it symbolically elaborates Lairope's mirroring gaze. At the same time, Narcissus' famous vacillation between identifying his reflection as self or other, and he goes on for several pages, having tremendous difficulty going back and forth. I think that vacillation allegorizes the developmental process whereby the mother's mirroring gaze reflects her child's identity back to her child. Oops, I'm getting ahead of myself. Yes, who internalize it as their own. They internalize that reflection. In Erikson's words, a self-realization coupled with a mutual recognition. There we are. Ovid chides the confused Narcissus with a notoriously cryptic comment that I'm not going to pronounce in Latin. That reflection you see is but a shadow of an image. Umbra, meaning shadow or ghost, is also translatable as a characteristic companion, as in one's shadow. This ambiguity allows the proposition that Narcissus's shadowy reflection is accompanied by the ghostly revenant of his mother's gaze. Poussin's third Narcissus is a much more object-related figure than Freud proposed, spellbound not by Cupid's arrow, but by an illusion mirroring. One of the most discussed aspects of Ovid's text is that vacillation that we just spoke about. Again and again, he seems to understand, now I get it. I am that other one. I've finally seen through my own image. I burn with love for me, only to immediately backtrack. Where are you going? Oh, cruel to desert your lover. He never really does give up the idea of the beloved other and directs his dying words to him. Alas, dear boy, who I have vainly cherished. His resistance to accepting his reflection as his own performs one of the challenges of infancy, the individuation of an independent self, the acceptance of the reality that mother is not me and is therefore not mine. This is consistent with Andreas Salome's perceptive reading that the Narcissus, oh, I'm sorry, I'm behind on my slides. Mother is not me and therefore not mine. Yes. Here's Andreas Salome. The Narcissus of legend gazed not at a man-made mirror, but at the mirror of nature. Perhaps it was not just himself that he beheld in the mirror, but himself as if he were still all. For Andreas Salome, the discovery that one is not all, that I, that does not include mother, is the primal psychic injury, what she calls the incomprehensible specular self-exposure to one's individuation. This psychic injury includes the new possibility that since mother is not me, mother could be lost. And I just want to interject here. I didn't make a slide for it, but in the famous epic Tennyson's In Memoriam, AHH, he speaks about exactly this. And it's really quite beautiful. He speaks about how that the infant's face pressed against his mother's breast does not know that this breast is not me and is not I. It's really lovely. And how this opens up for the infant the specter of loss. The poets got there first. To guard against the prospect of loss, sometimes people use regressive longings for fusion. If we are fused, then there is no loss because we're not able to be separated. And this is what Narcissus says in his last words. Now in death, we will merge at one. But the point that I want to stress here is that regardless of how we formulate his reflection, his increasingly desperate refusal to accept that his reflection is in fact himself also speaks to a desire to love another. Yet for Narcissus, to know of this desire is tantamount to death. Like regressive longings for fusion, desire, including forbidden Oedipal strivings, can summon fears of dissolution into the other, especially if the other is an idealizing mother like Niobe, who effectively causes her children's death, or a mother that cannot separate, like Lairope, so afraid of losing her son that she consults the oracle. If Echo screens this sort, oh, I'm ahead of myself again. If Echo screens this sort of consuming maternal imago, then Narcissus's flight from her desire is a flight from annihilation, only to succumb to the reflection that she offers. Poussin all but spells it out by filling the mirroring Achaea with the tears of Niobe, and by positioning it between Echo's legs. The site of Narcissus's birth is the site of his death. Poussin's last portrayal of Narcissus follows the third by a full quarter century. The Birth of Bacchus portrays two narratives in Book 3 of Ovid's Metamorphoses. The story of Bacchus, his birth and delivery to the nymphs that will raise him, and the story that directly follows it in the text of Narcissus and Echo. And I want to point out that this painting is actually in the USA. It's in the Fogg Museum at Harvard, and you can go see it. It's really quite amazing. In reality, when you see it in actual reality, as opposed to virtually, it's really quite surprising how dark the painting is. It's extraordinarily dark. And I've had to overexpose these slides a bit so that you can see the detail. There's a purpose for that. To say that this admittedly difficult canvas has been something of an enigma is an understatement. Its painter's intentions have been the subject of controversy since it was painted in 1657. Attention is first drawn to the central group. Mercury, in a red robe, presents the infant Bacchus to a group of delighted nymphs and confirms his paternity by pointing to his father Jove on his sumptuous celestial bed. Jove has reason to rest. He has just given birth to his son. When Jove's wife, Juno, learns that her errant husband impregnated the mortal Semele, the enraged goddess devised a way to attack and ruin her, as well as her child by Jove. She tricks Semele into insisting her new lover prove his divinity to her, and Jove reluctantly obeys. His mother, thus incinerated by Jove's gift, Bacchus is torn out of her womb unfinished and sewn into his father's thigh, where he gestates to maturity. Most art historians understand Jove, in this detail, to be attended by his daughter Hebe, in her traditional role as Jove's cupbearer. However, a detail from Carracci's Farnese ceiling suggests that this figure may be more ambiguous. In this primal scene, a sensuous blonde Juno, signified by her peacock behind her, approaches an appreciative Jove, a very ripped Jove in bed, just as the blonde in Birth of Bacchus approaches her Jove in her bed. If we imagine that a figure of Hebe can do double duty as Juno, then the painting follows Ovid precisely. After delivering Bacchus, Jove puts aside his weighty cares and, drink in hand, kills time in repartee with Juno. Thus, if we follow Poussin's instruction to read his paintings like a text, that's what he said, then reading the canvas from left to right, sort of, we can trace the narrative sequence in Book 3 of the Metamorphoses. Jove sends Bacchus to the nymphs for care, shielding him from his murderous wife. Jove and Juno argue, and they bring in Tiresias, who had lived as both sexes, to answer the question, under contention, who enjoys sex more, men or women? Unhappy with his answer, women, Juno blinds him. But Jove apologizes for this and compensates for his loss of sight with the gift of foresight. And this is how Tiresias becomes an oracle. He then exercises this new talent in the next story, when Niobe consults him regarding Narcissus. The linking element of Tiresias sutures the birth of Bacchus and the postpartum anecdote about his quarrelsome parents to the following story of Echo and Narcissus, a seamless transition that typifies the singular and witty achievement of the epic, Ovid's masterful spinning of the short fibers of myth into a long and unbroken strand. By visualizing the textual bridge between the two myths, Poussin attends to their broader narrative context. Another reiterative theme distinguishes this particular sequence of myth, the jealous wrath of Juno. In fact, the translator, Charles Martin, entitles the third book, The Jealous Wrath of Juno. Enraged by Jove's liberties, Juno took Semele's life and Echo's voice, and would have murdered Bacchus if the nymphs hadn't known to hide him in the ivy. Filled with hate and envious of everything she does not have, Juno is a portrait of the Kleinian psychoanalyst Herbert Rosenfeld's formulation of the destructive narcissist, who needs to control or fuse with their good objects in order to guard against feelings of dependence and envy, and destroys every good thing that escapes their orbit. Rosenfeld's destructive narcissist trenches on the mother who cannot separate from her idealized progeny, more Niobe and Lairope than Narcissus. Narcissus himself avoids any semblance of libidinal or dependent detachment until mesmerized by his elusive mirroring image. Rosenfeld explains that vulnerability is eluded and the destructive narcissistic state maintained in power by keeping the libidinal self in a constant dead or dying condition. Alternatively, fusion of self and object, that regressive longing for fusion, can defend against recognition of separateness. But in Poussin's painting, Juno's rage is tamed. Cradled by a cloud, she kneels respectfully before her god. Only the silent demise of Narcissus and Echo bears witness to her destructive rage. The antithesis of the sunlit gods, these anguished figures bear the ghastly pallor of death. They have little resemblance to the idealized figures of realm of Flora, in which they were the ones basking in the sun's glow. This rather horrifying Narcissus is deprived of all vanity. He has apprehended the abyss, the empty pool. Echo is a portrait of abject sorrow, her lovely head and shoulders echoing the contours of the distant mountains that resound with what's left of her voice. In her previous incarnations, she looks wistfully toward Narcissus, but here she turns away from his corpse, signaling the misattunement that characterizes her blind desire. Meanwhile, the cavorting nymphs pay no heed to their misfortune, too happily distracted by birth to take note of death. Somewhat luckily for me, the art historical literature has minimized the narrative substance of the myths described in Birth of Bacchus, reducing them to tropes. Instead, the discourse has focused on arguments over Poussin's textual sources. Apparently, the linkage of the two myths in the Metamorphoses was deemed of insufficient interest to them. Delori, Poussin's Seicento biographer, concedes that Birth of Bacchus is consistent with the sequence in Ovid's epic, although in his own words, the two myths do not belong together. In the 20th century, Poussin scholar and part-time Soviet spy Anthony Blunt deplores this impertinent underestimation, characterizing Delori's thesis as naively achieved, clearly inadequate, and lame. We can be quite certain, Blunt asserts, that if Poussin combined these myths in a single composition, he did so with a specific intention, and Blunt is right. Blunt is actually one of the authors of an authoritative textbook on Poussin. Poussin was his specialty, and Blunt, the spy, liked Poussin especially, loved him because every single little detail is carefully thought out, carefully planned, and yes, with reason. But Blunt's own exegesis of the painting is quite disappointingly tepid. For him, it represents, as almost all of Poussin's paintings do, the cycle of life and an obsessional catalog of its various polarities, birth and death, sterility and virility, water and air, etc., etc., etc. Other art historians dismiss Ovid altogether. Doris Panofsky argues that we are justified in assuming that the grotto setting represents the site of Narcissus's death, Bacchus's lair, as specified by Philostratus. Bachmann claims that Poussin's textual source is Plotinus, insisting somewhat obscurely that Echo and Narcissus represent the first victims of Bacchus's dangerous mirror. All of these writers believe that Ovid had no more access than we do to what Panofsky calls the obscure connection that seems to have been existed since ancient antiquity between Bacchus and Narcissus, and that Ovid's joining of their myths was a mere contrivance. From a very different perspective, Richard Meir contests the importance of textual sources altogether and argues for the primary relevance of visual sources. In his understanding, Birth of Bacchus is a pastiche of art historical references, a meditation on the dialectic of the replication of sources versus their interpretive reworking, that it's not about Bacchus and Narcissus at all. However, given Poussin's compelling and increasing fidelity to the narration of Bacchus and Narcissus in Book 3, I think Book 3 deserves another look. Together, Books 3 and 4 comprise Ovid's narration of the Theban cycle, the myths that describe the founding of Thebes. This cycle ordinarily includes the story of Oedipus, an important part of the story. But Ovid strays from this tradition And in the place where the Oedipus myth is normally told, he tells the story of Narcissus, which has no place at all in the Theban cycle. Indeed, in the Metamorphoses, Oedipus and the entire house of Laius go entirely missing. An observation long recognized by philologists and literary scholars, but absent from any prior art historical consideration of birth of Bacchus in English, and as far as I can tell, from the considerable psychoanalytic literature around narcissism and the Narcissus myth. Underlying this curious textual metamorphosis are the myriad correspondences, what Gildenhard and Zissos, classicists, call an intertextual extravaganza between Sophocles' Oedipus Rex and Ovid's Narcissus, which followed it 500 years later. We'll see that it's not just Oedipus Rex in just a minute. In particular, Gildenhard and Zissos emphasize how both texts enlist the pervasive motif of sight as metaphor and means of knowledge and its denial, exemplified by Tiresias, present in both stories, and who knows but cannot see. In contrast, Oedipus and Narcissus can see but must not know, despite all of the available evidence. Self-knowledge causes Oedipus to blind himself and causes Narcissus to die. Now, the biblical meaning of knowledge and knowing casts the relationship between Narcissus and Oedipus in a new light. Oedipus may not see who his mother is, but he does know her in the carnal sense of the word. The fact that Ovid narrates Narcissus' story in Oedipus's place supports the conjecture that Narcissus' reflection contains a revenant of his mother's imago. And if that imago evokes longing, and if, as Tiresias warns, Narcissus must not know himself, then this forbidden knowledge of the self may include forbidden Oedipal wishes to know his mother, another immaterial hope. Hinting at the frustrations of the incest taboo with compensatory oral regression, Narcissus despairs. Touching is forbidden, but looking isn't. Then let me look at you and feed my wretched frenzy on your image. Just as Narcissus's mirror image may serve as a symbolic screen for his mother's mirroring gaze and the Oedipal love that it might stir, the story of Narcissus serves as a literary screen for the story of Oedipus in Ovid's narration of the Theban cycle. Ovid stages the prohibition of knowing on another level. By making Oedipus literally disappear, he keeps the reader from knowing Oedipus too. Narcissus conceals what Oedipus knows. If we must not know Oedipus, then Narcissus must not know himself, and recognize that it's at the story of Narcissus, or just before it. This is the place in the text where Tiresias loses his sight and goes from unknowing and seeing to knowing and blindness. In the middle of Richard Neer's learned commentary, very erudite, on the interlocking themes of mirrors, art history, and self-referentiality in Birth of Bacchus, which he essentially believes is a painting about art history. In the middle of all of this, he floats the offhand observation, which is strangely obvious in retrospect, that perhaps, as certain psychoanalytic readings might suggest, the true story of this picture has nothing to do with Ovid and everything to do with Oedipal desire and fantasy, licensed by paternal authority, as the contented, sleeping child is handed off into a fantasy world of maternal sexuality. I would agree with Neer, but I would argue that this true story has everything to do with Ovid. In an echoing mise en abîme, Poussin's Oedipal interpretation of Bacchus, obvious, again, once pointed out, alludes to Ovid's replacement of Oedipus with Narcissus, and at the same time perforates the poet's textual screen, reconstituting the missing myth by painting Oedipus in effigy. Oedipus both is and is not in the painting. Poussin engages with the history of art, to be sure, but he also engages with the history of the text. So given that Oedipus failed to survive Ovid's epic, It makes sense to ask how he expires in his own myth. In Sophocles' Oedipus at Colonus, Oedipus, exiled from Athens, meets his death in Colonus. Poussin's dim, ivy-laden setting, I mentioned before how dark it is, reflects several details of Sophocles' description. "'Tis the haunt of the clear-voiced nightingale who hid in her bower, among the wine-dark ivy that wreathes the vale, where the clustering berries nod over a sunless, windless glade, the spot by no mortal footstep trod, the plaisance kept for the Bacchic god, where he holds each night his revels wild with the nymphs that fostered the lusty child. And fed each morn by the pearly dew, the starred narcissi shine, and never the sleepless fountains cease that feed Cephis's stream." Here you can see the fountain feeding the stream. Like Philostratus, Sophocles locates the death of Oedipus in the bower of the Bacchic god, with its wine-dark ivy and clusters of berries. Here too are allusions to Narcissus, the starred Narcissi, of course, and his father's stream. But if Poussin in Birth and Bacchus does intend to conjure Colonus, complete with Cephis's stream, then he locates Narcissus's death in the same place as Oedipus's. Indeed, he dies by the stream in which he was conceived, reminiscent of the placement of the mirroring echia between Echo's legs in Realm of Flora. Now, literary scholar Joyce Lowry shows that Book 3 of the Metamorphoses has an overarching chiastic or mirrored structure, all organized around the meaningful pivot, the irreducible duality of Narcissus and Echo, like mirror images, perfectly equal and perfectly opposed. The most remarkable aspect of Oedipus and Colonus is that when he finally expires, he simply disappears. The man was gone, vanished from our eyes. There fell no fiery bolt that reft him in that hour, nor whirlwind from the sea, but he was taken. It was a messenger from heaven, or else some gentle, painless cleaving of earth's space. So too does Oedipus simply vanish from Ovid's text in the place of the wine-dark ivy and the starred Narcissi, a painless, gentle death by deletion, a literary analog of the empty cleft, the liminal space that exists between the image and its reflection, between Narcissus's visual echo and Echo's auditory mirror. Clearly, it no longer makes sense to argue for an exclusive textual source of this painting, given the rich intertextual relationships between Book 3 of the Metamorphoses, Oedipus at Colonus, and no doubt many other relationships. I have long been struck in my clinical work by the depth of empathy and capacity for object relations in some people who would be otherwise classifiable as narcissists. Their description seems absent from the existing literature on narcissism. If we open the category of narcissism to encompass diverse perturbations in dyadic mirroring, then that category can extend to the consequences for children of the more conventional narcissists, the children of women and men like Niobe, whose parents use them as a self-aggrandizing mirror. These children often maintain what Winnicott called a false self, a false exterior to protect their sense of separate self. Children like Narcissus, who desperately seek the one who will reconstitute the unwavering perfection that he saw in his mother's eyes. The Metamorphoses of Poussin's Narcissus underscores the essential versatility of myth, a plasticity that remains untapped by theories of narcissism that involve specific and paradigmatic ideological mechanisms. Poussin's evolving vision supports a flexible conceptualization of narcissism. Rather than a singular disturbance, I propose that we call it a heterogeneous constellation of difficulties that involve various disturbances in the myriad dynamic and developmental aspects of mirroring and attunement, including some that may be, at least in part, biologically determined, and existing in a spectrum between the normal and the problematic, the narcissisms. This formulation accommodates multiple theories and manifestations of the narcissism, including a more object-related interpretation of its namesake, Narcissus, whose own aloof inaccessibility is screen and symbol for the love of the inaccessible other. Narcissus represents the person that is searching for love, but cannot seem to find it. Abby Warburg stressed the relevance of the anthropological and cultural dimensions of visual art, in addition to its literary sources. Certainly, specialization and solipsism impede this aim. The lack of awareness of the historical displacement of Oedipus by Narcissus in the psychoanalytic literature is a very good example. Conversely, while concepts such as the Oedipal complex and narcissism have been absorbed by and are actively utilized by academic inquiry, the academic discourse typically avoids engaging with these topics in any kind of material depth, even in the literature on Poussin's paintings of Narcissus. It seems that unique obstacles complicate the deeper engagement of the academy with psychoanalytic thought, as opposed to simply a lack of fashion or outright hostility. I suggest it reflects fear. Surely there is much at stake in Oedipus's repeated death and resurrection. Historian Christopher Johnson writes that for Warburg, the deeper one digs in historical memory, the more one confronts the full force of the effective phobic. Still, Oedipus survives, despite his banishment from Thebes, and despite his banishment from Ovid's Theban myths, despite the regressive pull of his replacement Narcissus and other attempts to not know Oedipus. Even Tiresias tried to blind himself to Oedipus's fate. This I knew well, he said, but had forgotten it. I want to thank you for listening all the way to the end, those of you that are still here.
Thank you very much, Adele, for this wonderful talk. Not only
thank
talk,
you.
Also presentation, a talk that in a somewhat metaphorical sense does weave the question of the image, the gaze, what is allowed to be seen, what is being seen, what can be heard and what can be read, also in the performance of the talk, very much. I would like to underline 2-3 traits of your operation, intervention. I think it is an intervention into many debates in psychoanalysis, but also on the margins of psychoanalysis, even in the field of art history and literary criticism. Underline first that you called it associative, a trait by which you enter into the topic. I would underline a true autobiographic trait in this. I like this intro very much because I think it's an important element of psychoanalytic writing. It doesn't have to come to the fore in the same manner all the time. That psychoanalysis and even psychoanalytic theory is a kind of autobiography of a very strange genre, but it cannot be extracted, the autobiographical traits cannot be extracted to it as if one would ever reach in a psychoanalysis some objectivist or purely theoretical assumption or evaluation of the other. So I find it very strong to write oneself into the endeavor and into the attempt of constructing something metapsychological. You pull away very forcefully narcissism, in the first move at least, the question of narcissism from self-love. You separate the two, basically saying the idea, the common sense, but not only common sense, also clinical and sometimes theoretical assumption that narcissism is self-love is wrong, or at least too simple. It's more complicated than that.
Yeah.
The Narcissus is not someone who loves himself. Is not only someone who doesn't love himself, is also not someone who does not love himself. I think you're saying something very complicated in this respect, very valuable in this respect. The third intervention is your construction of the argument as to three players, as it were: psychoanalytic theory and its history, the Freudian text and the post-Freudian interpretations of this text, the clinic, and what one would call the history of culture, and the history of culture and the artifacts in it with their own very specific historical and non-historical relationships. You construct this constellation by, and this is my first question, and the way I'm asking it, it's rhetorical because I think one could stress something different at this place, whether the analogy between mirror and vision, echo, and the auditory is not too much of an elegant construction for the sake of constructing the argument. Whether repercussion, reflection, echoing, mirroring are really the same thing. Whether the construction of the third and the fourth book of the Metamorphoses, which presents a chiasmatic and a self-enclosed structure, is really reflection, and then if that reflection is that a mirroring, and if that mirroring is that an echo, or is there not something of a split between seeing and hearing that is precisely performed by Ovid and by everyone who paints Ovid, etc. So I would be happy to hear a bit more about this stress and the incapacity to mirror the mirror onto the echo or reflect the echo into.
Well, yeah, it's it's an astute point, and I'll be happy to discuss that. But I want to go back to your first point, not to evade this point, but to the point about the autobiography. What I did not say was that I was very intrigued by the Apollo and Daphne by Poussin because I love trees. And my father was a tree lover who planted many thousands of trees in his lifetime, which we still have, these forests that he built to replicate his home from the Czech Republic. And so when looking at a myth that involves a person turning into a tree, this was of automatic interest to me. And I had known about the myth, but I never studied the myth. And to learn about the Apollo and Daphne myth and all the other myths in which people turn to trees, and to begin to understand some of the commonalities, for me was just a delicious adventure. It was wonderful. So thank you for that. I always encourage people who have the privilege that I have, which is to be able to write about whatever I want to. I encourage them to follow their interest, what makes them excited, what catches their eyes, to follow that as best as possible, and don't write about what you're not interested in, because it's dreadful. I appreciate what you said about the self-love. Yes, we don't know about Narcissus' self-love, and there are many people who have a lot of self-love who are not narcissists. It indeed has to be dissected. Sometimes people talk about healthy narcissism, and what they talk about is healthy self-love, but it's not narcissistic the way that we understand the word. So there's a real semantic problem here. Now, to your point, you're absolutely right. And an echo is not a perfect reflection, and a mirror reflection is not perfect. It's opposite, right? A mirror is opposite, and an echo is always incomplete. It's only just the last bits of what is being echoed. And so you're absolutely right. It was impossible for me to include that material in this, but I think that the echo could be seen as the imperfect mirror, the mirror that doesn't really work very well. I did mention a little bit about Echo's misattunement, that she can't see Oedipus's lack of interest. She pursues him anyway. There are misattuned parents too. I have a patient who has, and I'm going to fictionalize this, I'm not really talking about one patient per se, but I have a patient who grew up with a parent who was so intrusive and who wanted to control every aspect of his life. And he was an easily idealizable child because he was beautiful, smart, athletic, great kid. And the parent needed to intervene so aggressively in this child's psychic existence that he composed an alternative identity for himself, and he performed when he was with his parents. His true self was hidden away. These are parents who are horribly misattuned, and the reflections that they reflect onto him are distorted and carrying with them so much of their own wishes and desires. So yes, it is facile to say that the echo is a perfect mirror, and you're absolutely right. Yeah. Yes, the paper on this topic that I wrote goes more into that.
I wanted to present another idea to you concerning the lack of reading by Freud of Narcissus, of Ovid, basically. And it's a generous hypothesis. I'm trying to be generous with Freud to make something of this lacuna. It's too complicated, I think. And your presentation shows you even have to go to Poussin and the complications of Poussin and the intricacies of intertextuality and the relations between painting and literature at this place and the debates. It's very difficult to summarize what happens actually in the Narcissus passage in Ovid. We all think we know what it is. The guy falls in love with his image and he can't get away from it, and then he dies. It's not what happens. There are a lot of dialogues. The poet intervenes. Narcissus talks a lot. He talks to himself. He talks to us. He talks to the poet. So he goes, as you said, he goes at certain moments he seems to understand, and at certain moments doesn't seem to understand it more. So if you really wanted to summarize this, you would learn that you cannot summarize it. The only representation of the Ovid passage is a painting, a projection onto a different plane where other complications come up, and the painter Poussin makes it even more complicated, bringing in the mother and the reflections of the mother. So I would say, psychoanalytically, if you wanted to come up with the category of narcissism, you don't find the source in Ovid. I think
not at all.
Not at all. And I think what Narcissus in Ovid is more about is the question of identification than really narcissism. So then a more general question, when you emphasize how far ahead the painters and the artists of other disciplines and the poets are in relation to psychoanalysis, something that Freud said explicitly.
Yes.
There's something that Lacan said, something that Melanie Klein said. Why then, you don't do this strongly, but you do it a bit, I think, why find a solution for narcissism at all? If all these painters and poets tell us there is no solution for narcissism. Why quote Erikson twice with his, I think this is a modern myth, the myth of mutual self-recognition. I think that's the myth of modernity, which has no source other than it's being repeated as an ideological ideal, but it certainly has no source neither in Ovid, nor in Freud, nor in many analysts, nor in Poussin. What they tell us is it's a disaster. The only thing you can do is to rearrange the elements, and somehow some productivity will come out of it.
Well, yeah, I think that this is the problem, is that we already...
That at the outcome of a clinical experience, there is this wonderful accomplishment of self-mirroring, which at the same time is self-recognition. I don't find any source, neither in clinical experience, nor in the artists or the painters, for this assumption. I don't think it's an ideal to work towards. So my question is, why does narcissism produce this idea of this kind of solution to itself? While at the same time, you're saying it's not really such a problem, narcissism. If you look at it more clinically in detail, it's, the category vanishes and the traits you find are much more complex, and maybe one should stop calling people narcissists.
I would agree. Well, yes, I would agree. And unfortunately, It's funny, you diagnose the problems in the paper very well. I don't actually like psychoanalytic diagnosis. And very, very often my patients ask me, what is the matter? Am I a narcissist? Am I borderline? And I tell them I don't use these words. I don't use these terms. I don't use these categories. And however, when you want to write for a journal and you have an editor who says you have to comment on what this says about our current diagnostic categories and what you would do with them, you have to say something. And what I don't know if you noticed that I said that we can talk about the narcissisms as a category that exists on a spectrum between the normal and the problematic, not the normal and the pathological, but the normal and the problematic.
Isn't the normal also very problematic?
I think that in today's world, that's probably true. Maybe more problematic than the abnormal. But yes, I mean, I agree with you. I do believe that a child's identity, it doesn't happen so easily with the mirroring. It's not, it's not so easy. But to say that, because clearly it's not just looking. Mirroring happens in all sorts of ways. And when I say mirroring, it's not purely mirroring. That would be too easy. I think that what myth does is it takes whole experiences and whole phenomena and reduces them to a narrative, to a trope, to a motif. But the motif is very multi-determined and that it can be opened up. I see psychoanalytic thinkers and writers and theorists going to myth and reducing it to something. It's very reductive, most thought. This is what it means. This is what this painting means. I think about, who was it that said, Ricoeur, I think, that the poet opens up meanings. A painting opens up meaning. So we can say, what is the mirror? What is in the mirror? What is, what is this all about? As you said, is it, can you say that it is about anything? What does it mean when a person comes in and says to you, I cannot find somebody who makes me feel the way my mother did? As one of my patients once said to me, he said these exact words. I couldn't believe it, really, first session. And he says, I can't find a partner, which is a very common concern that people come to treatment with. And I said, what is the trouble? He says, none of them make me feel the way my mother did. And I said, and how did your mother make you feel? And he said, like I was the most amazing person in the world, but I'm not the most amazing person in the world, but I like feeling that way. And then he told me that his mother gave him a sweatshirt that said, when he was a child for his birthday, that said, under this sweatshirt is the most amazing kid. And he wore that sweatshirt every day until it was no longer fit him. And nothing else compared to that. And I thought to myself, wow, if I've ever met a modern day Narcissus, if you could call him that. But this guy had empathy. He had object relations. He cared about people. He wasn't grandiose. He was acutely aware of his limitations. But he wanted to be something more than that because he had a taste of it as a child. He couldn't get that taste back. And he was tortured, literally tortured by it.
That would be a trait you find in the Ovid. This fixation on the, but at the same time, the affirmation that it's a fixation, as it were, on something artificial to a certain extent. Reflection.
In fact, I very rarely write about clinical things. People are always telling me I need to put more clinical material in my papers. I need to come up with a theory. I need to explain how I would respond. But I don't like to talk. I don't like to talk about diagnoses and pathological ideologies that this causes this and this causes this. I think that's all kind of nutty.
Yeah, yeah. There's a question in the chat room, and the question
Sure.
is Jenny Davis Barnett. I want to also to say, if you have questions, please use the chat in the question and answer.
I'm sorry, who was asking the question?
Jenny Davis Barnett.
Okay.
So would you like to ask your question? Hello.
Sure. We can't hear you. Are you muted? No.
No.
Now we see you.
Now we see you. A picture of you. Now you turned off the microphone. Yeah, I think you have to turn it on again.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Hello.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Adele. This has been a fantastic presentation. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been lucid and very interesting. It's given me a lot to think about. So thank you for sharing your research in a public forum. I just wanted to ask you, I have recently been reading a fantastic book written by a scholar in Connecticut whose name is Nicolas Ely. And he published just last year a book about narcissism and selfhood in the Middle Ages.
Oh.
And yes, and I can send you that link. He's a brilliant scholar. And he gives a fantastic reading of Ovid's version of Narcissus, and he then looks at what happens with that in the Middle Ages. And you mentioned the notion of an injury.
The psychic injury?
Yes, and so what Ely does with his book, which I thought was brilliant, drawing on Lacanian's terms, and then he engages the scholar Claire Niobe as well.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so Ely looks at that when Narcissus is mourning, right? And he's striking his own breast.
Yes.
Right? He reads that as a wound of desire. And I think that Ely does a really brilliant job of making that very lucid. And I think that if we want to look at that as a traumatic repetition, trauma as if we understand with someone like Kathy Carruth, I wonder, do you think we could see Poussin's repainting of the Narcissus myth as a sort of traumatic repetition?
Well, sure. I mean, it's certainly possible. I think that whenever an artist is preoccupied with a theme and repeats it, we can't just say that it's for the connoisseurs. Birth of Bacchus wasn't painted for a connoisseur at all. Poussin had extreme liberties in painting whatever he wanted, sort of like a psychoanalyst who can paint, who can, do research on whatever they want, because we're not beholden to grants or to academic departments for particular sorts of things. Yes.
Yes.
In fact, Poussin didn't even engage in any kind of public competition.
Right.
To speak to trauma, he did enter one very large competition and was a semi-finalist and lost out. And he was so upset that he withdrew his application and never entered a public competition again.
Right.
And public competitions were a very, very important venue for Baroque artists to achieve renown, competition to decorate churches and so forth. Poussin never decorated a church. He didn't do frescoes. So he became a private painter for the connoisseur elite in Rome, which was almost unheard of back then. So he painted he painted Narcissus for himself. Birth of Bacchus, I doubt that, most connoisseurs would have wanted this picture in their house. There's this ghastly corpse in it. Very, very unlike the Baroque ideal. Now,
So if I say, if we look at Ovid and we see that the problem for Narcissus is that he cannot distinguish the simulacrum from the real,
Yes.
right? He can't realize at first
Not in
that
a
what
sustained way.
it is as an image, right? So what can we see then in Poussin's own psyche having some sort of obsession with an image and this need to constantly repeat this sort of psychic injury?
Well, he's working through something, and I don't know what it is. There are some clues, but I kind of hesitate to go any further than to speculate completely. He had left his family in Rome. In France. He was an expat in Rome. Very unusual for a French artist to live in Rome and be a success. Very difficult. He didn't see his family again. And did he miss mother? Did he miss family? Did he miss Mother France? He belonged to the church that was built for French expats in Rome. He belonged to that church, but he did not. He adopted Roman dress and did not identify very much as a Frenchman outside of the church. One thing that did happen to Poussin is that he developed syphilis, and by the time he painted Birth of Bacchus, he was really quite sick. And if you see the painting or in detail up close, you'll see that his line is bad. He can't draw a straight line anymore. His brush is quavering. And indeed, he needed to stop painting after 1664. So he only had a few more years in him of painting before he put down his brush. Mercury is a figure that we did not talk about. Mercury comes to bring Bacchus to the nymphs, to save Bacchus from Juno. And Mercury was, the element Mercury was the only medication or treatment known for syphilis back then. And Poussin had mercury treatments. So we have Mercury bringing a little boy whose life was saved to the nymphs to take care of him. You do have to wonder, about the meaning of Mercury there, about the possibility that he's also not talking about the resurrection of Oedipus, but the resurrection of himself. And Absolutely. Of course, the care of Bacchus.
Thank you. This has been fantastic.
Thank you, Janet.
You're very welcome.
I wonder, Adele, whether one also in this place one could not stress another trait by saying once again that I think in Ovid's version of Narcissus, you find all the positions possible. He is very aware that he's falling in love with an image. It's not that he ignores this. On the contrary, he says that that's what happens. So there is a certain exhaustion of the possibility of speech over what's going on. It kind of sets free something that in Ovid, in the text, is very present in the punning, in the repetitiveness of certain syllables, and in the poetic structure, that it sets something free that seems to be of the order of repetition and the drive, a category of Freudian provenance. And I think it also shows up in Poussin. I think the underlines a strong intervention of the painting Narcissus dead. Yes. I think that's the moment. I think he's concerned with death and decay and dissemination. This element in Narcissus, and not the image and the reflection. He's asking himself, I think, how can you save painting from dissemination? How can you save the painter from dying? I mean, every painter asks the question of painting, first of all.
Absolutely. Well, Poussin was definitely concerned about the survival of his paintings. He said so in his letters. It's interesting that Ovid Ovid makes a rather grandiose statement, although I think that sometimes, these things are deserved because he was fabulous. But he says at the end that he's not concerned about his own life because he knows his poetry will live on. He's not concerned. Poussin was concerned.
We have a remark by David Forrest written. We have a question by Stathis. Stathis, why don't you go ahead, ask your question, and then we can, I will have a look at the comment that was written in the chat.
Very good. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. First of all, I have to say this is a brilliant paper, and I wonderfully constructed and a kind of a wonderful journey of reading in various registers, Adele, and I've had a kind of hideous day, and this comes at the end of a very tiring day, and the paper really kept me alert throughout. Thank you for that. I also think the exchange that you guys had, Marcus and Adele, was wonderful and really instructive to, I hope, to everyone who was listening. So, I mean, I have various things to say, but I just want to ask just one thing, which is, I hope it doesn't sound stupid, but one of the things that I didn't expect, but I thought was wonderfully evocative, was your move at the end of bringing in into the Narcissus business, the edible business, and my question is in the context of appreciating and respecting, appreciating and applauding your comment that you are reluctant to use the categories, the clinical categories, as they are sort of easily handed out, to use the category narcissist, etc. So it's in this light. I mean, I want to hear you say a little more about to what extent the Oedipal encounter, and here I will not use complex in exactly the same spirit as you will not use easily narcissist, right? That the Oedipal encounter is narcissistic, or you understand how I mean it? I mean, what I want to hear more about what would be the elements that we see in that kind of Narcissus experience in the Oedipal encounter.
Well, you know, it's interesting stuff, is because some people have said that that Oedipus is much more narcissistic than Narcissus is. There's this thing in psychoanalysis where people talk about stages of development. Whenever I hear the word stage, I get a little bit concerned. I really prefer when psychoanalysts talk about positions, because positions are things that you can come in and out of, like Klein. You know, there is a paranoid position, there is a depressive position, which really isn't about depression, but rather acknowledging the possibility of loss. I think that this is far more compelling than talking about oral, anal, genital, which I, you know, could basically toss out the window. Although it does describe certain stages of development in a child, I don't know that it's necessarily so important theoretically. When people talk about the Oedipal stage, or, you know, they talk about, psychoanalysts have this thing where they talk about Oedipal state, the Oedipal stage that you go through, and then the Oedipal complex is resolved. And that it's resolved because the child, the little boy, gives up his lusting for his mother. And instead, it's kind of like, if you can't beat him, join him. If you can't beat dad, then you join him and you identify with dad. And then you don't want to hang out with mom making cupcakes anymore. You want to go out and play ball with dad. And that's the resolution of the Oedipal complex. Well, it's really not so simple. And then there is this idea that whatever comes before the Oedipal period, or the Oedipal complex or stage, is pre-Oedipal, and that's dyadic. So you have a dyad and then you have a triad. It's as if the child, when they're 4 years old, suddenly discovers, oh, daddy's here. You know, it's nutty. You know, it's nutty. The idea that there's a dyadic thing and then it's triadic because the kid suddenly grows up enough to realize that dad's the competitor. This is crazy. This is, you know, my children slept with us in our bed, and it was very clear from the get-go who was competing for whose attention, you know. So I think that there are always dyadic and triadic dynamics in play. Freud also read Oedipus in a very selective way, and this has been beautifully
Absolutely.
written about, beautifully written about. He only focused on certain things. He did not focus at all on the fact that Oedipus should have known better. Here's a guy that is, the oracle tells him he's going to kill his father and marry his mother. Well, then why on earth would that person kill a middle-aged man that he doesn't know? He should have known better, but he's arrogant. He's very, very arrogant, and the narcissism. But what I wanted to say was that when Freud looks at the Oedipus complex, he sees father as a competitor and must be killed so that mother can be gotten. Well, there's many, many other ways of looking at this. You can also think about the boy, the little boy, as identifying with father and wanting to be like father and wanting mother because father has mother, so he wants him too. This is mimetic desire, René Girard's idea of mimetic desire. There's a dyadic thing happening there because he wants to be like daddy. All little boys want to be like daddy. They want to be, why do little boys love it when their father picks them up and he holds them in the air and he picks them up and then the baby says, I'm taller than daddy now, because he wants to be tall like daddy. He wants to identify with his father. This isn't just a way to get out of the Oedipus complex. This is there at 2 years old, but we always, historians talk about the problems that people have with needing to kind of historicize periods of history. We do that with human development too. So there's always a tension between the dyad and the triad. The boy feels guilty when he hates his father and is jealous because father has mother. That's upsetting to him. He feels guilty about it. Myth is filled with succession stories, and the Oedipus story is a succession story, gone wrong. I'm just trying to remember something here. I wanted to go back to, so I hope that answers your question, Stathis, about, Narcissus and Oedipus. I mean, the child, every child has grandiose fantasies about themselves. They're infantile. It's very normal. It's part of development.
Of course.
And who is the first giant? I wrote a paper on Poussin's giants, actually. It was my last paper on Poussin. He painted giants. He was very interested in giants, which was never a popular topic in Baroque painting because they're gruesome. But the child is the first giant for the child are his parents. They're giants. He aspires to that. Look at the Halloween costumes of children when they're very small. Who do they want to be? They want to be superheroes. The smallest kids want to be superheroes. So you have these little Batmans, and you have the Hulk with the fake padded chest so that the child has a six-pack. You never saw a more proud boy than the boy wearing the Hulk padded torso and having a six-pack, They want to identify with powerful people, and the powerful people in their lives are their parents. So there's envy there. There's a wish to identify, and there's competition, for sure, from a very early age. So I guess that's my point.
Thank you.
Sure.
There's a question by Ursula Haddock. Would you like to ask a question in speaking, and then we can? The question is, I'm interested in the connection, so I'm going to read it, between Poussin's fear of the survival of his work with his painting's placement in the Johnson house. Is there a narcissistic, anti-narcissistic idea there? So what's Johnson doing by placing Poussin in that particular house?
That question is a chapter, but thank you for asking it. Yes, there are many, many, many layers to the placement of the Poussin painting, which has been it's been restored 3 times. It doesn't even look like itself anymore. There's a copy of that painting in Britain somewhere, and you can't even, it's destroyed. The painting is being destroyed. But Johnson is making many comments with this painting. He identifies with the hero Phocion in many ways. I can't go into that because I would talk for half an hour. But Johnson was very interested in ruins, and the glass house. One of the inspirations for the glass house is the post-war landscape of Europe, with houses knocked down, and the only thing that was surviving were the masonry chimneys and furnaces. And the glass house is a house of glass, and the only thing that is solid in it is the brick chimney, which is in the middle. And so if you look at it and you kind of ignore the glass, what you see is this brick chimney. So it's basically like a ruin. It's an anticipation of becoming a ruin. And he is ruining the painting. The painting is a ruin. He himself saw himself as a ruin. And the glass house was a way for him to reverse his reputation, which had been ruined because he was a Nazi. The other thing about the painting that Poussin has is that its provenance was argued. It wasn't clear if it was a copy that Poussin authorized or if it was something that he actually painted. And back then, there wasn't, in Poussin's day, if it came from the workshop of the master, it didn't really matter. But in today's world, it matters a lot. And so Johnson put that up, knowing full well that some people believed that it was a copy and not an original Poussin. And so there's a question about whether, what's the painting really worth to Johnson? Is it an original worth taking care of, or is it a copy? Now, Johnson was also accused of being a copyist, that he copied Mies van der Rohe. In fact, he was such an adherent, just talk about giants, he was such an adherent of Mies van der Rohe that people called him Philip van der Johnson. They made fun of him for being a copyist. And the glass house is a near copy of Mies's Farnsworth house. Mies wanted to build a house of glass, and Johnson beat him to it. Talk about succession. He stole his thunder. Even though the Farnsworth house and the glass house are actually completely different buildings, they're still the 2 first glass houses, So there are many things to be said about the painting being destroyed, The painting is a fascinating story because it's an allegory of Johnson's own ruined reputation that he was trying to save.
Well, thank you. I think we can come to a closure tonight.
I want to thank you, Marcus, because your points are wonderful, and I'm not used to getting such good discussions.
Oh, thank you. I mean, with a paper like this, has been pointed out, it's extremely elegantly constructed and really compelling. It's really quite a pleasure to have this kind of theoretical psychoanalytic presentation. And I don't think that you need the clinic. I think you do the clinic like that, with that. I think when you're being accused of not using the clinic, I think it's completely wrong because your thinking is clinical. It's very palpable in the way you construct your...
Well, I think that whenever you try to say something clinically, it ends up bringing closure to something instead of opening something up. And psychoanalysis really should be about opening up, not closing down, like poetry, that there's ambiguity, that there's many layers, that we never really can analyze a dream. Just like we can never really understand another, and to put a category on somebody and say, well, this is what you are, so often doesn't work. There is one exception to all of this that I will point out, which is Rosenfeld. And I have found Rosenfeld's understanding of the destructive narcissist as so spot on with certain people to understand their need for control and their need to destroy, the destructive envy. And we've had a president who has been the most incredible illustration of that, his need to destroy that which he envies or what threatens his own sense of power or goodness. This I find compelling. And I use that clinically a lot. So, but it's not a description of a, Rosenfeld doesn't say how they got that way. It's phenomenological. This is the way they are. And that allows you to make interventions with them in treatment. You know, but it doesn't say, well, this is why they got there.
No, thank you. That's the good, will open the Rosenfeld, which, I mean, the descriptive side and the phenomenological side of authors like him, and particularly him, are much more valuable than the conclusions and the categorization that follows it. You know? So to keep a clinical mind going, it's very important to read these descriptions. And as you said, the openness and the explosive nature of clinical material.
You know, I think it is useful when people describe certain ways in which people deal with problems, like the construction of a false self or the regressive longings for confusion, for fusion. You know, these are useful clinical descriptions that point to aspects of human nature that almost all of us can relate to. They're mechanisms. They're ways that we are in the world, not diagnoses. Anyway, I think we're on the same page here.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to all of you.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah.
And thank you for everybody that came and listened.
And there will be a succession of events, and you will get the information through the usual channels.
Come to our next session. We'll have an interesting lineup.